Alright, so this video is going to be a little more technical, but I think it'll be really informative. It's kind of a compilation of stuff that I've learned. I think I've really gotten good at even in the last month or two. That being said, I don't consider myself an expert, but I think I really am starting to get a good handle on mixing and mastering. So today specifically, I'm going to talk about getting the desired loudness for a mix so that your mix sounds really loud and good when you compare it to other tracks that you listen to on Spotify or Tidal or Deezer or whatever. There are a few things that make a track have a good loudness. I'm going to talk about EQing, panning, specifically stereo panning. I might get into compression. I might even get into AI spectral compression plugins and AI spectral EQ plugins, which are kind of controversial because a lot of people will tell you that you shouldn't use AI spectral plugins, which I'll tell you what it's about. But I think those kind of plugins can be really helpful. But first, let's talk about EQ. So I'm going to pull up a project here, Boring Friend, from my upcoming album. So this is a little bit what it sounds like. I'm such a boring friend. I'm such a boring friend. 'Cause all I So what is EQing? I'll actually pull up an EQ plugin in Logic here. So basically what an EQ is you're boosting or lowering the volume of different areas of the frequency spectrum. So if you want to cut everything, say below 122 hertz, you can do something like that. For a lot of tracks in a song, you really don't need anything under 120 hertz. And then for tracks that are supposed to produce bass, you don't really need anything under 30 hertz. So for a lot of bass frequencies like bass guitar or kick drum, I'll do that where it's cutting everything below 30 hertz. And then I'll even play around with like cutting a lot of the highs that I don't need. If I want to boost certain frequencies in the mids or something, I'll play around with that, but I'll get into that more in a second here. This applies to every digital audio workstation. I've worked in a few other audio editing programs, but I mainly stick with Logic nowadays. So as you can see here, I cut everything below 120 hertz, 121 here. I wanted some more of that kind of low mid part of the guitar, so I boosted it. There was something funky going on in the 2 to 3K region, so I decreased that. And then I cut some of the highs here and boosted some of the 4K to 10K region because I like the sound of that. But really it all depends on the type of sound you're going for. This is a rock track, so it's like very specific to this genre that I'm working in. For my vocals, I routed all the vocals to a stereo bus. As you can see here, I EQ'd a lot of stuff. Again, under 120 hertz, I EQ'd that out, and then I cut some of the highs as well. On the individual vocal tracks, I did cut some frequencies. I didn't need to, but I didn't really know I was going to route them all to a bus at first. And then I just boosted some parts that sounded good to me, like the highs here, and then some of the 2K and some of that low mid 200 area. And then I also added some reverb to the vocals and routed that to a bus. What I do with reverb and pretty much every effect is I stereo pan it. Other DAWs have it as well, but this is how Logic does it, and it's kind of weird. You have to right click it and click stereo pan. At first it'll be on balance, but then you have to change it to stereo pan, and I adjust it so that there's nothing on the very extremes of the stereo field. So there's nothing extreme on the right or the left, and that'll actually help with your perceived loudness, and that'll help with your overall loudness. And what I do on those effect buses as well is I EQ what I don't need. You can see in this stereo delay track, I actually cut everything below about 140 because I realized I could go beyond 120 and it still sounded okay. So the bass guitar, you can kind of see I cut everything below 30 hertz because I don't need any of that. And then I started cutting things in the highs as well because I didn't need those. Same with the kick drum. I cut everything below 30 hertz and then I started cutting the highs as well. I still wanted some click in the kick drum, but not too much. Some genres will need a lot more click in the kick drum, like metal or post-hardcore will usually have a very clicky kick drum, but for the genre I'm working with, which is more indie rock, I don't like to have a very prominent kick. The tom drums are kind of interesting because some of them you can EQ like up to 120 hertz depending on, well, I didn't do it here, but some toms do produce more bass frequencies. I kind of cut below 66 here, for example. So you can kind of see this was like the lowest part of where the toms were hitting, and I kind of sneaked up to that point with this band here. So I cut everything below 66 hertz. When I mastered this, I played around with widening, but you don't want to do too much widening because that'll actually mess up the loudness. And same with reverb and other effects. You don't want to increase the effects so much that it'll kill your loudness. I used this free EQ, I think it's free, by Tokyo Dawn Labs. It's called a Slick EQ, and I do that to give the track a bit more color. So I'll boost the highs a little bit, kind of decrease the lows as much as I want. For this linear EQ that I have open, I have it set to side only. For a lot of tracks, you want to cut the lows on the sides from at least 120 hertz, and that will also give your track a lot more loudness. And then I also cut above 20,000 hertz here. And then for the last EQ on the master, I cut everything again below 30 hertz because I don't need it. And then I cut everything above 20K because I don't need that. So really it's just about not overusing effects, also cutting frequencies you just don't need and boosting the ones that you want. For a lot of the tracks in here as well, I either make them mono or I stereo pan them. And generally for panning, you don't want one element, or you don't want several elements to take the same place in the stereo field too much. That'll also kill your loudness. So you want to vary where things are in the stereo field, so you have to pan them differently. For example, if for some reason you can't hear a vocal in one part because your snare is kind of overbearing, what I've done in some of my songs, I've actually panned the drums a little bit to the right and I've panned the vocals a little bit to the left in that one part so that I can hear each of those elements a lot better. And then when I don't need them panned anymore, I, put them back to the position they were already. In Boring Friend, I have this bell part. And that bell part is stereo panned way to the left. What I really should have done is drag that part so that it's not completely touching the left side, but I didn't do that for some reason. It's fine. So that's a little bit about panning. And another thing, if you want to measure if your track will do well on streaming services, I highly recommend you use something called Loudness penalty. It looks like this. You can select a file, and for example, if I select Boring Friend, it'll load up here. And you'll see on Spotify will turn it down 3.3 decibels, and that's fine. You don't want it to be right at 0, and you don't want it to have a plus sign, because then Spotify and other streaming services will turn it up with their own limiters, and you don't really know what that'll do to your sound. It can mess up the sound. So I generally aim for this number to be negative something, -1, -3, it doesn't matter, as long as it's turning it down just a little bit. For AI spectral plugins, for EQ, I use this Gullfoss EQ, and what that does to my understanding is it'll actually analyze your track, and it'll increase certain frequencies and decrease certain frequencies depending on what it thinks your track needs. And I find it very helpful, but I think it also gives the track a really nice sound. So I've been using it on all the tracks for this upcoming album. And I do the same kind of thing, but with compression. And this is also a paid plugin I got on Black Friday. Can't remember exactly what it's called. I think it's like Smart Comp by Sonable. I think the company's called Sonable. What it does is it analyzes your track, and then basically it's automatic compression, but you can also adjust some things if it's not quite right, and I've done that on some of my songs. You don't need those two things, but for me, I've found it very helpful. I didn't talk too much about compression in this video, but I think this is a good starting point. So yeah, thank you. I hope you found this helpful, and see you next time.